All Things Alice. This podcast will explore the cultural phenomenon of Alice in Wonderland as artistic landmark and global symbol of inspiration and imagination. I'm your host, Frank Beddor, the author of the Looking Glass Wars trilogy. Let's explore, what is it about Alice? Welcome to the show, everyone. This week, I've got something a little different. Today, I'm joined by James Agee, and he's, among other things, a Looking Glass Wars superfan. But he's also a teacher, a traveler, and an author. He's a super talented, very busy guy, so I'm thrilled to be chatting with him about all things creative and, of course, all things Alice. Hey, James, welcome to the show. You're early. I really appreciate that.
Yes.
Excellent. It's just so funny. I don't know. I remember I was out on my patio and Sarah had mentioned that you had wanted to buy the books and that you had read them when you were in high school and that you bought the whole collection. And I just called her and said, that's very curious to me. I would like to have that gentleman on the show, and and that's where it started. And then Sarah sent me a little bit of a recap, some bio information, and it turns out that you've written all of these books, and so you're a fellow writer, as also an educator and a reader, and yada yada yada. But so I'm. This is the first time I've had a reader of my books that came on my website, bought my books, and I asked on the show. So welcome.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So I'm going to start with, because this is a Alice in Wonderland centric, not that I deal with Alice all the time, but because I don't know you, I'm going to ask you a straightforward question. When was the first time you were introduced to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? The book or some piece of pop culture? Your choice.
So I feel like I was always kind of familiar with Alice's Adventure in Wonderland from the time I was little. It was just one of those stories you hear over and over. But in terms of discovering the Looking Glass Wars, that happened when I was in high school. And I feel like it took so long for me to find the books because for years I just was not interested in reading because I thought it had to be these prescribed readings from the school if I was going to read. And then for whatever reason, just found out, I can choose my own books. And that's when I started loving reading because I was able to pick things that I liked. And one of those was The Looking Glass Wars.
Well, that's really interesting. Did your parents encourage you to to read when you were younger, and then you got these assignments, like in elementary and middle school, and it was
Y-
overwhelming? And
Yeah, I never really like disliked reading. My parents always read to me when I was little, but I feel like once I started school, that's all I had time for the majority of my time outside of class. If it was reading, then it was reading something that they had assigned. And then I think I got a Kindle for a Christmas present one year. And that was when I started just going through and finding all of these books that had been there that I had never given a chance and or even thought that I would be able to get into. And it started kind of a lifelong passion for reading after that.
wow, that's a very good parenting story for those of us who have kids who sometimes push too hard, and on top of the reading that comes from school that's required, encouraging kids, pushing a little too much to try books. Like that happened to me, very similar. I wasn't doing a lot of reading, and my mother and my grandmother really wanted me to read Alice in Wonderland, and I just wanted to go outside and play in the woods. And it really wasn't until high school and after high school that I discovered my love of reading, because, to your point, I was not a really fast reader, so the assigned reading took a long time. So there was no chance I was going to be reading in my free time. I lived on a lake in the woods in Minnesota, and so I wanted to be outside. So,
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And the school that I went to was, like, it was a smaller school, kind of a rural area. And so, we had a school library, but it wasn't necessarily stocked with young adult literature, which is now such a popular thing in school libraries. So I feel like I just didn't know it was there. And I don't know that it would have changed much if I did know it was there, but it just happened at the time that I feel like it needed to for me to get into reading. And that at that point, I was like, I'd like to tell some of my own stories. And that's kind of what started me writing.
so was there a genre that you read that you really loved that you started writing in?
Yeah, so the first genre that I ever fell in love with was fantasy fiction. And it's just there's so much of it, and I felt like it was this untapped world that I just didn't know was there. And I'd always loved, movies, television shows, and things that were in that genre. So it just was natural for me to gravitate towards those types of books.
Which kind of movies did you start with in the fantasy or TV shows that led you to writing, or what books that led you to writing fantasy?
So it was definitely like the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings series that I was just obsessed with growing up. And it was kind of cool because I got to grow up with like the Harry Potter as they were releasing movies. I feel like I was in that period of school myself, so it was pretty neat. Um, but ironically, I never had read the books. And so when I finally did get around to reading the books, I was like, this is even better than the movies.
How
And it was
much
a pretty
time
cool
was in
experience.
between how old were you? So you were the age of the characters while you were watching the movies, and then how old were you when you started reading the books?
So I feel like I was pretty young when the movies started being released, and I didn't actually get into the books until late into high school, probably 11th, 12th grade. So it was significantly later on. It was years after I had watched most of the movies. I think some of them were still being released, but it just had never occurred to me to sit down and read them because they looked so intimidating, I guess the size of
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
And now looking back, I'm like, the longer the book, the better. But um, at the time, it was one of those things that had just kept me from approaching them.
It's so funny you say that because I was the same way with, high fantasy. Some of these books, Game of Thrones, I mean, they're like 1,000 pages. And I
Yeah.
look at these tombs, I'm like, no, nope, I'm not taking that on. And for me, it was Game of Thrones. I had watched Game of Thrones and I was like, okay, I want to read the book. And in reading the book, I was stunned by how well laid out chapter to chapter in the book was and how it matched the TV show. And like you, I was much older. I didn't read Game of Thrones when I was in high school. I don't even think it was around, but I get the idea of coming to the book after the movie. Matter of fact, with my series, with the Looking Glass Wars, Harry Potter had been out for a number of years, and people were doing both in viewing the movie, we're getting a lot of kids your age that were at the age of the characters, and then watching the movies or reading the books in series as they were growing each and every year. And so, from a publishing standpoint, that's what they were really looking for. So, when I came with my book, and by the way, I had no idea because it was my first book, so I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know there was all these categories. So they said, "Oh, well, your book has a 7-year-old. Nobody wants to follow a 7-year-old, and then she's 13, but then she quickly turns into 20. So you're not going to get any of the Harry Potter people, kids who want to read. They all want to read their age." It's like, well, I think there's more readers out there. There's more diversity than that. And it took publishing in the UK and for it to be successful, for it to come back and people discovered it. But I mean, they might be right because I certainly haven't sold books like Harry Potter did. Of course, those books are genius. But I think following in movies or in the age and the novels it speaks to a certain audience, but it was a huge crossover success. So, I don't know if these rules really apply. A good story is a good story. What about you? When you're writing, do you write characters your, you know, adult characters, or have you written relating back to when you were in middle school? Where do you like to come up with your characters?
I've wrote characters kind of all over the place on in terms of age range, and generally, which is also why I probably don't sell very many books, is I write what specifically I'm wanting to read, and I haven't it went into specific demographics and been like, oh, I'm going to write a book just for middle schoolers interested in this type of thing. So I've just been writing specifically what I want to read. And at the end of the day, I'm just happy to have these stories, out there.
And you self-publish primarily on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, and primarily Amazon though.
How's that been going?
It's been going pretty good. The process isn't too crazy. I prefer to spend most of my resources in the writing phase, and then I've worked with some great editors to try and get the stories where they need to be. And then I've worked with smaller publishers in the past, and at this point, I prefer just the self-publishing over the small publishers I have worked with, just because I feel like I have a lot more control over what I'm putting out.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the great things about being a writer. You get to write what you want, and you can have an editor work on it, but it's your final decision. And if you can get the book out there in exactly the form you'd like it to be, well, then why not? And if you could make a couple bucks, even better. But it's not easy for anybody to make money publishing. So the process of writing and the joy of creating and then the sharing, and hopefully somebody reads it, even if it's one person, and absorbs the book in the same way that thought you were putting the words down on the page. And so you get this back and forth, and that's really satisfying if you can connect with a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty much how I feel about it.
So how you discovered the Looking Glass Wars on YouTube? What was there a ad, or was it one of my trailers, or what was it? What attracted you to it?
I believe it was actually when the whole booktuber phase was starting, where people were starting to review books, and I had so many connections that I had made just through commenting videos, and then I was reviewing a few books at the time on my channel, and um, just meeting people that way. And it was one of those books that had been recommended to me through a connection on YouTube, and I don't remember specifically if it was a video or if it was someone saying like having it on their Goodreads that they were currently reading it. But once I saw the cover and then like some of the illustrations, I was immediately drawn to it. And then it was, I think, about the time that Arch Enemy came out. That was the first book that I ever pre-ordered. Was
Oh, okay.
that specific book, because I just couldn't wait for that that part of the story.
Wait, so you pre-ordered it having read the first two, and you just
Yes.
assume, oh, well, that's a very nice compliment. Now you're really interested in art. Do you recall what art was it? The covers? I mean, you mentioned the covers for Looking Glass Wars. That's Doug Chang, who did the work on Star Wars. He's an amazing artist. So, and you probably can see some similarities in his droids and things like that. But the publisher really liked that book, and it got a lot of it motivated a lot of boys, especially when I was going to middle schools to read. They were reluctant readers who would read it because they wanted to see how the card soldiers would unfold.
Yeah, I mean that was part of it. Seeing that cover and just reading the synopsis and thinking, how is this going to work? How is this going to tie in with the Alice in Wonderland that I'm familiar with? And I loved it because pretty much from page one, you had taken something that I was familiar with and that I think a lot of people were familiar with, and just fleshed it out so much more and made it more real, I guess, giving more details we previously had. So that's what hooked me from the start.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it was fun to have a starting place with Alice's Adventures and then spinning everything. Gregory Maguire, I'm a fan of his, and we're colleagues, and I would say we're friends. We've done a few promotions together, and so I took a lot of inspiration from Wicked and his prequel story. Did you ever read that? Did you ever read Wicked?
Wicked has been on my list for years, and I think now since there's additional books in the series, I've just been kind of waiting to probably going to do the audiobooks of those just to because I
Yeah.
hear so many good things about them. And that's another thing I just recently went through and for the first time listened to the audiobooks of the Looking Glass Wars series. And it was kind of like reliving it, but in a different way because previously when I had read them, I just read the books. And so that was a pretty cool experience too.
Wait. So can you describe for our listeners in what way the written word in an audio form impacted your experience? And I'll just preface by saying Gerard Doyle was so amazing as the reader and the different characters and the sound effects, and that at times I said to myself, I don't think I wrote that line. I wonder if he changed it. I was like, wow, this is so much better as an audiobook because Gerard Doyle's voice.
Yeah, I think when I initially read the books, I had imagined things one way in my mind. And then when I was listening to the audio, it wasn't necessarily that it changed it, but I was able to kind of set back and relax a little bit more and to just have this read to me, this story that I already knew, but that it had been a few years since I had revisited. And I think he does the voices of the characters and everything so well that you don't have to question who's talking and what's going on because it brings it to life in a completely different way. So I would say I would encourage anyone who's read the books to also listen to the audio because it is a different experience. Same story, different experience.
Well, thanks. You also bought a number of the graphic novels. Have you been a fan of comics in the past, or did you want to just fill out the Hatter story? Were you curious, or did you know about those? Those are like four different questions. Let's start with, were you a fan of comics? Then, did you know about Hatter M? And three, did you want to fill in the Hatter story? If so.
Yeah, so I had actually been a pretty big fan of manga a while back, and
Okay.
then I had read some graphic novels, but I was more towards the manga side of things. And I didn't know necessarily that this even existed, this other side of the story. And when I found out about them, it was definitely something I wanted to add to my collection because again, like you had just asked, I wanted to know more about these characters. And I love the fact that there's such a focus on Hatter in these because he's one of the characters that just kept me reading. And I believe the Cheshire Cat, like the assassin,
Mm-hmm.
that was another one that from the start, I just love that concept because it's such a mischievous character to begin with. So to add that layer to it, I just want to know more about what's going on in this world because the stories are technically like they're finished, but I feel like there's so much left there in this world to explore, and I'm glad that you're going back and doing that.
Well, thank you. I am trying to expand the world currently, but the graphic novel was inspired. I've told this story many times before, but I still find it amusing. I was in the UK promoting the book, and I was at a school, and I know you're an educator, so I want to talk about that in a minute. But I was at a school, there was probably 100 kids, and one kid kept putting his hand up. And finally, I called on him, and he said, Mr. Beddor, I'm very, very upset that you have not finished your first book. And I said, I don't understand. What are you talking about? And he goes, well, in your novel, you synopsize what happened to Hatter during his 13 years. And that was terribly frustrating because he's my favorite character. And I really would like to know what happened during those 13 years. This is like a 10-year-old. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I laughed it off. But then when I got on the plane, I started thinking about it, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I could do a comic book filling in those 13 years. And that was I wish I had the boy's name because I would have given him all the books for free and thanked him because I had a great time. So, on the education side, I'm really curious your experience in teaching, and Sarah wrote that you were going to France with a bunch of students. And I found doing school events and having the littlest impact, but in just an hour, being able to stimulate kids and having them say, I read your book because you were a really fun speaker and you weren't boring. That was my favorite comment because most of the writers are really boring. They just read and they're boring. And so I wonder when you teach, how you approach engaging the students so that they can follow and then absorb the lesson that you're wanting to communicate.
Yeah, definitely. I think just like you said, and then also for probably every educator, keeping the interest of the student is one of the most difficult things, especially when you have some classes that last hours at a time, which is currently the school that I teach at. I've got students half a day, and then the next group comes in for half a day. So, keeping their interest for that long of a period of time it can be difficult. But I've personally found that every group that I've ever taught is different. So you just have to take kind of an individualized approach for that group to see what's interesting to them and what matters to them. And I think the fact that you've made your story so relatable is why students have such an easy time listening because there is something in these stories that they can relate to and connect with.
I'm sure that's what you're talking about when you have a large group or over a number of hours. You don't have to entertain them the whole time, but you have to at
Right.
least amuse them or make a connection like you said, that they can relate to so they understand why they should lean in a little bit. And it's really a satisfying profession. Having done school visits, I thought, okay, I understand why teachers are teachers. And then at the same time, I think as a country, we don't we don't value teachers and how important and difficult it is to connect, and in connecting, how it can be transformative for kids. And so people that don't have opportunities to have teachers that are engaging or outside speakers come in that give them kind of a perspective and let them lean in, then they are shortchanged.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, I'm currently teaching graphic design, which is the subject that I've been teaching for the past year. And the students tend to already have an interest in that when they choose the class. So it's a little bit easier to keep their interest because they're doing something that um, the class itself just sounded interesting to them. So they already have that sort of drive to participate when they get there. Holding it throughout the year is the difficult part, but
Mm-hmm.
that's what actually drew me to the graphic novels of the Looking Glass Wars because when I found out about them, I thought this is very interesting to get more of the art that I originally kind of fell in love with the books and see, this through a different perspective since also worked freelance in graphic design for years. And then to get the opportunity to teach it to a group of high school students is just fantastic.
Wait, is it Marshall University or Marshall High School that?
So I do part-time with Marshall University, and then I also teach graphic design to high school students. For Marshall University, I teach instructional design to educators looking to get their graduate degrees. And so it's a different approach to the design side of things, but it's kind of combining the instruction with the design, which I absolutely love and think is really fun. For anyone, it can be fun. So
So you have a lot of right brain, left brain because you're, a writer and very creative, but then you're heavy on the tech side. Were your parents and how did they prepare you? And I say this because I have a 18-year-old going off to college, so I'm just curious.
yeah, so from a very kind of early age, I guess about middle school, I had decided I like school enough to make this what I want to do. I want to be on the other side of the desk teaching. And then I always had a bunch of other just kind of ideas for businesses, stories, just things that would kind of come up and I would just really want to do it. And I've got to say they just supported me in whatever I wanted to attempt or try. Some things I tried and they just never worked out. And then other things I've tried and I've stuck with for years, and they've always just been there to support whatever it is that I choose to do. Um,
So in success, in failure, especially in failure, taking chances, doing so many different things. Not everybody is inclined to stick their toe in and publish a book in on Amazon or even start writing a book, let alone self-publishing and going out to indies, and then also having a really clear idea that you want to be an educator, but then expanding and doing things that speak to you that are fun. I think that I love that message for young people. I love the idea that especially in your 20s, you should do everything that you want to do, whether you make money or fail or are super successful. Push it because once you're a little bit older, you're going to probably define where you put all of your energy, and especially if you have a family, then time is really precious.
yeah, definitely. And I've noticed that a little bit more as I'm now officially in my 30s. It's I'm having to allocate time a whole lot more specifically than I used to. I could just, whatever I wanted to do, it would be nice to come home from work and if I want to write, if I want to draw, if I want to just relax. Now it's like I have to have a plan almost set out to manage time because things have gotten more and more busy, I guess, over the years.
In any of your books, do you do any of the illustrations? Do you have your own because you're an artist?
Yeah, I think it's been a while since I did any illustrating myself for the books, but I do almost all of the covers exclusively. I design those. And so that's a really fun part because I feel like I know the stories pretty well, having written them. And so getting to have that extra form of expression as the cover art is something that I always look forward to after I finish the book.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. I need you to pick one book and give our audience the elevator pitch because I work in Hollywood and people have short attention spans, and I did a lot of Comic Cons. And when I went to talk to kids, I sort of mastered the 30, the 45, the 60 second pitch. You can take longer than that, but why don't you just share with us your favorite book or a book that you would like my listeners to take a chance on and read and tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so one of the books that I think I spent the most time on it's called Dead of Night, and it's part of a series I wrote called The Blood Curse Chronicles. And it's the reason I spent the most time on it is because I actually wrote the book and then completely rewrote it because when I was working with the editor, it was such a process of going back and fixing every little thing that finally we just got together and we were like, should I just rewrite this whole thing? Um,
I know that. I know that story. Okay. I'm with
So
you
I spent
now.
the most time on that one, so I have probably the biggest connection with it. But it's the story of this family of vampires that live in a small town in Virginia, and they own a funeral home, and that's kind of their way of managing being vampires and getting the resources that they need while providing a service to their community and fitting in, basically. But the kids of this family, they find out that there is a way to kind of break this curse that made them vampires, and that's what the whole series is about, discovering how to break the curse and potentially get back to being human or just ending their eternal lives.
Wow, I like that. That's a very high concept, very clean. Applause, please. That was very good. You
Thank
should
you.
go to Comic Con and sell books at Comic Cons because I think people would respond to that. Okay. All right. So that's a series. How many books in that series?
There's 4 books, and I've over the past few years just like wanted to go back and expand it, but I don't know. I've never sat down and had a story that I felt like was worth adding to it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so at some point, if I do feel like there's something that I can add to that that hasn't already been said, then I would love to go back and expand it a little bit more. But until that day comes, there's just 4 books.
Okay, so you also, I read that you like to work in multiple genres. So, what would be on the other side of a vampire story in terms of something that you've written?
I think the other side would just be kind of a memoir that I had written about my
Okay.
own life growing up, and it was more of just an exercise in putting my own thoughts on paper, my own memories on paper, because I've found too, the older that I get, those little moments that, you like to reflect back on, they're not as clear as they used to be or not as vivid. And so I did that more for myself than anything. But that was a totally different experience than writing a fictional story about vampires.
What were the challenges of doing that? And did you feel like you were tapping into a memory or an idea of a memory?
That was the challenge, is I wanted to make sure it was as accurate as possible, but then also how do you do that? How do you
Mm-hmm.
make it exactly like you experienced it? And so I think I struggled more writing that than any of the fiction books that I've ever written, simply because I wanted it to be as accurate as possible, but also knew that that's to an extent not even possible to have something 100% accurate to the events that happen, because we all experience things differently and we all
Exactly.
remember things differently.
It's very subjective as well. So, how many books did you say total that are available on Amazon?
I believe there's currently 30
30?
published,
You're
30
making me
total
feel
that I've
really
written.
bad right now. Okay. All right.
Well, for a while I was trying to do 1 to 2 per year, and then a lot of that came from when I was working with a smaller publisher. They had more of a strict schedule for writing, I guess, and so they wanted me to write as soon as I was finished with the book. They're like, "What's the next one?" And so now I'm lucky to write a book every 2 years, but I feel like I enjoy the process a little bit more because there's no specific timeline for me to follow.
Mm-hmm.
It's finished when I'm done writing it.
Right, right,
So
right. What are you reading right now? You have anything that's interesting that you're really into?
yeah, so after I finished re-listening, well, going back and revisiting the Looking Glass Wars, I thought, what other stories that I really enjoyed from that time period are now available on audio that I'd like to go back and do that with. And so I'm currently listening to This Dark and I think it's This Dark Endeavor and Such Wicked Intent by Kenneth Opel.
Hmm.
And they were another one of those series that I loved because it's told the story of Victor Frankenstein from a completely different perspective and fleshed out the story more and gave more information, which is part of what I said drew me to the Looking Glass Wars. It was something that I had been familiar with, and it was a good jumping off point to get into that story. And so I'm really enjoying just going back and reliving a lot of those stories that I love to begin with.
Well, it makes sense now that that you like that you're a fan of reimaginings and why you would have found Looking Glass Wars on YouTube. So, if you were a character from Alice in Wonderland, who would you be? Let me ask you this: if you were a character from the Looking Glass Wars, who would you be and why?
It's such a tough question. I think in terms of just the character that I feel like I would relate to the most, because there was just so much confusion with this character, but they wanted so much to be a part of this amazing story was Hamburg Molly, like
Mm,
because she's there and you wonder for so long how she fits into this story. And then when she finally does it, just, I mean, it all makes sense when everything comes out towards the end. And I feel like I relate to her character so much because she's so in love with this world herself and wanting to be a part of protecting the queen that she's really willing to just do whatever it takes. And I love that about her. So probably some version, of that
yeah.
character
Yeah, well,
or
that's great. I mean, she's sort of a reluctant. Well, no, she's not a reluctant hero. She wants to be the hero. Alice is reluctant, so she's the opposite. And she doesn't exactly fit in, and she didn't know who her father or mother. So she's got a little bit of the who am I that she has to come to terms with. And then when she finds out that Hatter's her father, then she's got to live up to that. Yeah, so you like to be the underdog.
yeah, I mean, ideally, I would say Hatter, but realistically, I think it would be more of, yeah,
Yes, yes, that's all of our fantasies. But who could we really be? A little hero and a little bit flawed. Humbert
right,
Molly.
right.
Yeah. Well, what is this trip you're taking to France?
So we actually just got back from it,
Oh,
and
okay.
I personally have always loved France in general, so it's my fourth time visiting, and it's just something I like to offer to students locally where we are kind of a rural area. I love to offer international trips for them. About every 2 years, I do those with students, and then I just love to travel myself in general. So I like later in about a week, I'm going to Ireland for a while, and then Italy for the first time. But this past time being in France, it was a little bit different because when we went to Montmartre, I was thinking back to the Looking Glass Wars where I just read it, and there were so many real world connections in those books that I had almost forgotten about from the original time that I had read it. And so I was actually thinking about the Looking Glass Wars when I was there because it's just such a vivid part of the story. And having been there and seen these things in person, um, it makes it so much more relatable, I think.
James, I wish you were a doppelganger that could keep splitting and multiplying and splitting and multiplying because you've said so many kind things and mentioned the Looking Glass Wars in all different kinds of aspects of your life. And by the way, your life seems incredibly rich, with your travel and your education and your teaching and your writing and your tech work and your art. You seem to have a very full and diverse take on the world, and it's been a real pleasure, chatting with you, and thank you for supporting and reading and sharing the Looking Glass Wars, which has been my life's work. I started in 2000, so I'm coming on 25 years of working in this world and looking to expand and fill in some of the blanks. And, chatting with you is great motivation.
Well, thank you for writing these because, like I said, if it wasn't for authors like you, I don't know that I would have ever decided to write my own stories and definitely wouldn't have jumped into reading like I did and be 15, 16 years later still reading as many books as I can. So I thank you for what you've done.
I'm going to check out this vampire story. It sounds like a very fun idea and also sounds like it could be a good TV show. So I'm going to encourage my listeners, please check it out. We'll post it on frankbeddor.com. And James, enjoy the rest of your summer and keep writing, keep reading, and keep sharing.
Thank you. You too.
Really appreciate it.